One. Well, good morning. We are here today with Bob Reeder, and very excited to be in his study here today and ready to learn a little bit about some of the history of our faith. And Bob, before we get started, I'm wondering if maybe you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about your education, your background, your career, and maybe you could help fill in some blanks there.
There are many blanks. People have been asking that for years. Yes, John, I'm happy to. I was born and raised in Philadelphia and its western suburbs that you are familiar with. I went to Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Many of the people listening to this may not know there is a college where the big battle took place. And one of the interesting things is that the college was there at the time of the battle.
Ah.
They actually used one of the existing buildings as an infirmary, as a hospital during the Civil War itself. So it's kind of interesting from that perspective.
Wow.
I was a history major at the Gettysburg College and I got my degree, a Bachelor of Arts, history major and biology minor. And in addition to getting my degrees there, I also met my wife there. And we got married later, but we met at Gettysburg College, where she also attended and graduated, also as a history major, I mentioned. I went directly from college to law school. That's kind of unheard of at this time, but in those days, that was the regular course of events. I went to Villanova University School of Law. It is now the Charles Wisner School of Law at Villanova University. And as I may have mentioned to you before, it's amazing what $25 million donation to a university will get you. I graduated, I was on law review there, and order of the coif for those who are law-minded and knows what all that is. And then I clerked for a federal court judge in Philadelphia, Eastern District of Pennsylvania, for 2 years. Then worked for a large law firm, in those days about 100 lawyers, for 4 years before moving to a very small law firm. I was the 7th lawyer there. And some 30 years later, when I retired, the law firm had about 485 lawyers in 18 offices in the United States and 1 office in London.
Wow.
It was a great time to be a lawyer, a lot of exciting, interesting stuff. But frankly, I'm glad I'm on this side of that project rather than coming up through that project.
Yeah.
You will note there, and public speakers should never do this, but you'll note there that there is no MDiv degree or similar degree there. So my teaching and the like, as I've done in the past and will do here, is largely associated with history and can frankly be gathered by anybody who has an interest and will take the time and energy to do it. So it's not a matter of formal training.
Well, I've looked at some of your scholarship and how you have applied your own, I hesitate to call it self-educated because you are in fact a history major, but your education you've applied to many classes in both biblical studies and history, and so you're very well read, and I appreciate that. And so we've collaborated on having you teach a series on the minor prophets coming up, starting in October. October 1st, I think, is our kickoff day for that.
Correct.
And that'll be on Thursday evenings, and we'll appreciate having you there. But we talked about having some background, building in some background for that study with some of what we're going to talk about today. So with that in the rearview mirror now, Bob, let me talk to you a little bit about the Hebrew Canon of Scripture. Patrick and I are doing a series preaching through the Old Testament. I have spent a rather long time preaching in the Old Testament over the last few years. And so maybe it would be a good idea to stop and take a look exactly at what we're talking about. And I know that there are some similarities and there's some differences in the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Old Testament, our Old Testament. So I'm wondering if you could share with us um, if you would agree that there are some differences, and then if you can elaborate a little bit on some of what those differences might be.
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. We discussed one of the tools of my quote self-education or whatever, and for many, many people, is the fact to understand that the Old Testament and the New Testament, although today we'll be focusing on the Old Testament, are frequently divided into what are generally referred to as divisions. And it's just a tool, frankly. The divisions are not, as I understand it, inspired, but they're a tool that people who have studied the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament have put in place to help one kind of at a 10,000 feet level start their way through the books of the Old Testament. We'll start with the Hebrew Old Testament and then move into our Old Testament. The Hebrew Old Testament has three principal divisions. And those divisions have been in place for many, many years. And in fact, they've been in place since at least 130 BC. Whoops, we have something different there?
No, that's it. We're
okay. The three that are there. They've been in place since at least 130 BC, which are found in the book of Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus, which is one of the Deuterocanonical books like that. So it's been around for a very long time. And the first one on this slide, as you can see, up at the top is the three that are there: Torah, and then Nevi'im, and then I can't pronounce it, Ketuvim.
Ketuvim or a Ketuvim.
Thank you.
Yes.
So you see those are the three major divisions that historically have been in the Hebrew Old Testament. The first one, and I guess I should say, since the next line down is this word Tanash, which I assume is not in everybody's immediate vocabulary, but that is simply anachronism, or not anachronism, what's the word I'm after?
Acrostic.
Acrostic for Torah, Nevi'im, and Chevium. So you see T, A, then N-A, and C-H. So the Hebrew Bible is often referred to as the Tanakh. So that's how you get it. Now let's go back and look a little bit at each of these three divisions and see what they are and what books of the Bible they are made up of. First is on the screen here, says Torah. Well, Torah is just the word for law. And it means basically the teaching or the learning, and it's God's instruction to his chosen people.
Yeah, I would add to this, if I might, that Torah is sometimes used narrowly, and sometimes it's used broadly.
Right.
In its narrowest sense, it's the Ten Commandments. Most frequently used to refer to what you're talking about right now, the Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then broadly, it's sometimes referred to the entire writings, the entire Tanakh.
Correct. Right. Thanks for that clarification. That I confirmed is what the research would show. Torah, again, another way you can look at it, it's either law, Torah, or another word that's often used for this first division is Pentateuch. We might be more familiar with the English, what our Pentagon is. A Pentagon is a five-sided building. The Pentateuch is 5 books. So it's the first, made up of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And they obviously are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That is the first section. This section is also frequently referred to as the written law. And one might ask the question, Bob, why is it referred to as a written law? And one might suggest that means there's some oral law. And Judaism has a very extensive oral law in addition to the written law. It was called, before it was written down, the Mishnah, M-I-S-H-N-A, and that is the oral law. And then ultimately, it's very complex, at least 600, not 10 commandments, but there's at least 650 commandments. And eventually that was reduced to writing. So the oral law became the written law. but it's really like the second written law, if you will. So this first large section is the Torah. It's the written law, and it's our traditional first 5 books of the Bible, which I think we frequently refer to as the Pentateuch. The second category is Nevi'im, and you see it's N-E-V-I, and then there's apostrophe. John, can you tell us what does that apostrophe stand for?
Well, it's really more in favor of our pronunciation because we have 2 I's stuck together. And so they just tell you you're supposed to stutter when you get to Nevi'im.
Well, I have no trouble with that.
Yeah, and then the I-M at the end, Nevi'im and Chetuvim. The I-M is the rough equivalent of our letter S. In other words, when you see an I-M at the end of a Hebrew, anything in the Hebrew Old Testament, that simply means that it's a plural. It's a plural noun. So you have the prophets, the Nevi would be the prophets, the Nevi'im, the Nevi would be a prophet, and the Nephiim would be prophets, plural.
Great.
And same with the Chetuvim.
Right. See, MDivs do come in handy.
Well, every now and then.
Every now and then, right. So this is the second large section of the Hebrew text, the Hebrew Bible, and it is prophets, plural. It is traditionally divided, subdivided, if you will, into 2 sections, the former prophets and the latter prophets. And the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel as 1 book. We'll talk a little bit later about in our Bible, it's 2 books, 1st and 2nd Samuel's, and also Kings. And again, it's 1 book there. So the former prophets are made up of 4 books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And then the latter prophets are made up of another group of 4 books. We generally refer to these, the first 3 anyway, as the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then most interestingly, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about this, a book in the Hebrew text is called the 12. And so you'll see there's 4 books of the former prophets, 4 books of the latter prophets, and that makes 8 books of the prophets in the Hebrew text. I want to do, you'll see up on your screen here, 2 quotes. These are 2 authors that I've used in preparation for our class that starts, as John has mentioned, on October 1st. The first person is Brote. He has a understanding the New Old Testament, and in his book called Reading the Old Testament, an introduction, and his quote says that the 12 was a single unit. And then the reason for that is, quote, probably because they were all copied down one after the other on the same scroll in order to save space. Frankly, it strikes me as a little peculiar or unusual or non-academic, if you will, that they wrote this down to save space. But having said that, I also understand that you couldn't go down to Staples at that point in time and buy a ream of papyrus and pull it out. So papyrus was expensive, it was difficult, and maybe the practicality, if you will, of the situation was at least one of the driving elements why the Hebrew text, it's 1 book, the 12. Now Shepherd, on the other hand, he has a commentary on the book of the 12. It's a very academic book. We'll use that a fair amount in terms of our regular course. He has a much more academic, sophisticated, less practical reason for it. And he argues, and that's the right word. I don't know that this is generally accepted. I certainly think the discussion of it is widely accepted, but whether his exact view is accepted or not, I'm not really sure. You'd have to go up to Westminster probably and talk to an Old Testament professor. But his explanation is there is, quote, internal evidence that an unnamed final composer brought the 12 works together to form a single composition, and that the final composer deliberately connected the books so that they occur in a particular arrangement in order to communicate the intended theological message. So he has a much more inspired, much more academic, less practical viewpoint, that these were all combined as one book purposely and intentionally. I've read the book, so I know it's largely based on connections with Jeremiah, like that. And so he presents it as a much more intentional purpose to do the theological purpose, showing God's judgment and why there was judgment. And you'll note, for example, as we get into the course itself, that the minor prophets are not, I emphasize that, are not in chronological order. So you might say to yourself, well, why are they in that order? And Shepard's answer is they're supposed to be in that order because it presents what the single composer, the final composer wanted to show. So that's the book of the 12. And that book, and I probably haven't said this, the book of the 12 was made up of what we refer to, the last 12 books in our Bible, as the minor prophets. So there's 12 of them there. So the first large division is law or Torah. It's the written law or Pentateuch. The second large category, Nevi'im, is prophets. And the third one is called the writings, sometimes called the holy writings. And John, I've never gotten this pronunciation correct. In fact, it's kind of interesting to me. I find in several different places, different spellings. I believe it's got to be the same root word. The two spellings that I've come across regularly, Ketubim,
yeah,
or Ketuvim. And I guess that's a pronunciation issue?
Yeah, it's just a pronunciation issue because our Western throats are unaccustomed to making the guttural sound that the CH does in the Hebrew language. So actually it's Ketuvim, but to our way of thinking, that CH is more closely akin to a K, so it would be Ketuvim. The second issue is the V and the B, but in the Hebrew alphabet, the V sounds more like a hard V or a really sort of a B sound, so it'd be Ketuvim. So that would be the writings in history, and that also explains why Tanakh ends with a CH in this instance on this sheet here, but in other people read it in other places and it'll be T-A-N-A-K or sometimes T-A-N-A-K-H to communicate the same thing. So in any case, it's just a pronunciation thing, and Ketuvim is equally acceptable as Chetuvim.
Right. Yeah, I'm not very good on that guttural
yeah, I know.
pronunciation like that, but thanks for that explanation. It's funny, in the research that I've done, it really doesn't explain the different spelling like that. But so this third section, the Ketuvim, is called the writings, sometimes also referred to as the holy writings, like that. And interestingly enough, some but not all also tend to divide this third section of the Hebrew Bible, the writings, into three different groups or subgroups also. The first of these subgroups is what is referred to frequently as wisdom, and that's Psalm, Proverbs, and Job. And we'd be very familiar with that kind of approach, if you will. Then the next 5 books are called festivals, and it's the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Esther, and Ecclesiastes. And then the last 3 books are history, and they would be Daniel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, which in the Old Testament canon is 1 book, not 2 books. And then Chronicles, also 1 book in the Hebrew canon, and not as 2 in our canon. So all in total, the Hebrew canon is regularly made up of 24 books. The first 5 in the law, then there's 8 in the prophets, and then there's 11 in the writings. And last time I added that up on my calculator, that equals 24 books. So one might say, and logically say now, well, what's the difference or differences between our Old Testament and the Hebrew text? And our is really traditionally made up of 4 divisions, not the 3 divisions as in the Hebrew text. The first one is easy because the first division in the Christian Bible or Old Testament is the same as in the Hebrew text. It's the law or Torah or Pentateuch. It's the same 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The second division traditionally found in the Christian Old Testament is what we refer to as historical. And again, if you look at these as tools rather than something specifically inspired, the historical is frequently subdivided again into pre-exile. And we'll be spending a fair amount of time on this in the class itself. But a lot of the world is divided into BC and AD, but a lot of the Bible is divided into, the Old Testament is divided into pre-exile, exile being 580, usually considered 586 AD. There was actually 2 exiles before that, but this third one was the complete destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 586. And the people then, the third wave of exile going into Babylon at that point. So you have this first large division in historical of pre-exile, meaning before 586, and that's Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. We divide those into 2, and 1st and 2nd Kings, we also divide that into 2. So the historical pre-exile is made up of 6 books. The historical second subdivision of will, and if one is pre-exile, one might brilliantly conclude that the next group is post-exile. And the post-exile historical books are 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra as one book, Nehemiah as another book, Ruth and Esther. So you'll have in our second division 12 books, 6 pre-exile and 6 post-exile. Then we have our third division is the wisdom. And again, I showed you, or we talked about it briefly, is that sometimes the writings in the Hebrew text are also several of the books called wisdom. And our wisdom books are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. So that makes up 5. And the last large group and the fourth group and the end of our Old Testament are the prophetic books. And again, we traditionally subdivide those. Again, these are tools to get into, kind of give you a first heads up about what these books are about, or the major prophets. And again, we'll probably say this 100 times. The difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets are not that the major prophets are more important than the minor prophets, but rather, generally speaking, are based on the size of the text, not on the importance of the text. So the prophetic books, the major prophets are deemed in our Old Testament: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then the minor prophets, we have 12. The last 12 books in our Old Testament are the minor prophets. And we'll bother, I guess they're down there, go from Hosea right all the way through Malachi. And so rather than having one book of the 12, we have 12 separate books. So in our New Testament, we have 39 books, or I'm sorry, in our Old Testament, we have 39 books. So the brilliant question, John has asked me this before, is if the Hebrew text has a total of 24 and the Christian Old Testament has 39, what's the difference between them? And is there any substantive difference between those? Well, the short answer is the way to get to from the 24 to the 39, you have to divide Samuel into a second Samuel, because in the Hebrew text it's 1. Same thing with Kings and Chronicles. So there you, quote, pick up, if you will, 3 books. You divide Ezra and Nehemiah, so you pick up an extra book there. And then because in the Hebrew text, it's the book of the 12, and we have 12 separate ones, you pick up an 11 extra books. So if you add all those up, you get an extra 15 books. And last time I was checked or did my calculator, if you have 24 and you add 15, you get the 39.
So the differences in the two canons, the Hebrew canon and the Christian Old Testament, it is purely structural. There's no substantive difference in the two.
Right. John, I hate to take your thunder, but a very famous preacher I know uses the word takeaways. And that would be my takeaway from this particular session, if you would, is that while they are organized differently, while the prophets in the Hebrew text are in the second division and of 3, and in the Christian text, they are in the last division of 4, when you look through them, the books are the same, the books are identical, and therefore the substance, if you will, of the Hebrew text and the substance of the Old Testament Christian text are the same.
Okay, good. Well, that's a good takeaway. I like that takeaway. Well,
I give you credit every time I use that now.
I'm an educated theft. Bob, I appreciate that. Now, so we have the 3 divisions: the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, making up the Tanakh, which is our Old Testament, and then and that's here are the divisions, and the divisions change, but the books are the same.
Correct.
So that's that gives us some good insight. Now, when you actually teach the class then on the minor prophets, I think what we're going to discover is that some of them were pre-exile, some of them were during the exile, and some of them were after the exile. Is that not correct?
That is correct. Although, frankly, I'm going to have to challenge myself. I'm thinking whether any of the minor prophets actually wrote during the period of exile, but I think they did. So I think they're clearly the major ones are pre-exile and post-exile, and 1 or 2 may have been actually during the exile.
Yeah.
I know Daniel, for example, was during.
You're right. You're right. As part of Jeremiah, or part of Isaiah is, and Daniel and Ezekiel are both during the exile.
They're all major prophets as opposed to minor prophets.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's a very good point. Thank you. Well, that's wonderful, Bob. I appreciate that a lot. Now, what are you going to have for us next week?
Next week, my first quiz was going to be, scare people already, my first quiz, it's kind of like who's buried in Grant's tomb. The Hebrew Bible was written in what language?
Well, if you're asking me the question,
I am.
I would hazard a guess that it's actually written in Hebrew.
See that? I now know why I follow you, right?
Okay. So, well, we learned something already.
So next week, we're going to try to do a little bit of an overview. How did we get from Hebrew to English? Because I doubt that people in the congregation, other than John and maybe Patrick, very few people speak or read Hebrew. So what we're reading is English. And I think a question that we should be more familiar with probably than we are is, what is out there historically? How did we get from Hebrew to the Greek, to Latin, to English? And so next week, we're going to spend a little bit of time walking through that, hopefully at a 10,000-foot level.
Wonderful. Well, Bob, we're going to look forward to that. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you taking your time and sharing your scholarship with us. We're very interested in seeing how all this develops.
All right. Look forward to it.
Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Right.
All right. God bless.
Further the affiant saith not. That's how lawyers end things.
Which means?
Means the affiant, the person who's taking the affidavit, is saying nothing more.
Okay. Well, okay. We're gonna, whatever you said, that's what I agree with. All right, Bob. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.